Hi, I'm Jackie Krasna, and I am here with the Freedom Under Natural Law, or FUNL, number 4 conference. The theme of this year's FUNL conference is Humanity Rising. And what we speakers have set out to do is to not only help others to understand natural law, but we'd also like to inspire action in others that they may get out there and teach natural law toward the upliftment of humanity. And my presentation today is going to focus on the role of the individual and, in fact, the great power that you, the individual, has in helping to influence the world into a condition of freedom. And the title of my presentation today is The Tipping Point of Mass Awakening. The role of the individual in waking humanity up to freedom. But before we begin, I have a few words. First of all, I'd like to say that the information that I am presenting today is not new. In keeping with the tradition of one of my mentors, Mark Passio, I'm going to state there is nothing new under the sun. This information today is not a novel strategy. It is not part of a fad, a new hack that I have figured out. These are tried and true techniques for starting a movement. And where I borrowed these techniques from is Malcolm Gladwell. I would like to credit the work of Malcolm Gladwell for his book, The Tipping Point: How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. And I will reference this book during today's presentation. And last of all, I'd like to say that this presentation is a direct call to action for you, the viewer watching, because it points at what you must change in yourself and what you must do in order to create the positive change that you may say you want. So let us now dive into the first section, which is the goal: to assist in waking humanity up to freedom. Now, this might seem like an impossible, overwhelming, daunting goal, but I'm really a firm believer in always setting the bar really high, because even if you don't reach that high bar, you are much more likely to get very close to it than had you set that bar lower, you see. But we need to understand that the problem is slavery. In order to recognize the value of a goal of a mass awakening and of freedom, one must recognize that there is a problem. And the problem is that the current condition of life on Earth is slavery. We live in a world in which a select few individuals who call themselves the authorities claim rulership over the rest of the population, and they place humanity in a state of duress and compliance through the constant threat of violence. So if one does not obey the decrees of these masters, that person may have property stolen from them, they may be thrown into a cage or arrested, or they may even be killed, whether or not a wrong action was even committed. And furthermore, we mercilessly enslave, mutilate, slaughter, and commodify the rest of the animal kingdom without necessity for food, clothing, product testing, and entertainment. And in the words of the now retired animal rights activist Gary Yourofsky, if they're not slaves, then what are they? Free? Okay, so we need to understand that the problem is slavery for all life on Earth at this present time. The goal then is to wake up to freedom. And what do I mean by that? Well, the truth is that no one is a slave in nature. And the concept of man-made authority is an illegitimate claim. These conclusions about the sovereignty of sentient beings are intuitive and self-evident. But most people have been brainwashed into believing that they are subjects to government or other man-made false authorities. The truth about individual sovereignty can be reached by understanding the impossibility of legitimate ownership by another. Your life, body, and property are yours, just as other beings' lives are their property, not anyone else's. These are truths that the individual must first wake up to in order to obtain internalized sovereignty. We need to understand, first and foremost, that we are, in fact, free, sovereign beings, and nobody can legitimately claim ownership over us. And then this realization may hopefully extend outward in the form of externalized freedom in the aggregate for all life, if this knowledge is passed on to others. All right, so we need to share knowledge of natural law and speak up about it if we would like the rest of humanity to wake up to freedom, to understand what freedom is, and to wake up to a condition in which freedom is present in the world. Okay, and that brings us to a subsection called Waking Up. We're going to explain what waking up really means. What does it mean to have an awakening? Because these expressions, such as waking up, or to say that somebody is woke, have been heavily perverted from the real meaning. And so let's clear up any confusion about what it means to be awake. So first, for waking up is activating true care. And I do look at the activation of true care as the first step to awakening, because true care is the generative principle or the causal factor that governs creation. So waking up begins with activating desire and empathy or true care within oneself, because the activation of our heart center enables us to push forward with our desires through an act of will, no matter how difficult the task at hand. The ancient Greeks had a word for love that transcends beyond romantic or familial love. This word is agape, which means brotherly love or charity. This means caring for all other beings and being able to place oneself in another's shoes, looking from another's perspective and being able to almost feel what their suffering must be like. Ways to activate true care can include facing harsh truths about immorality, corruption, and the suffering of others. Facing the music can help us to care and spring us into action. So I do suggest looking at the dark side if you really want to activate true care in yourself. And next, in the process of waking up, and this is more or less in chronological order, although waking up isn't exactly a linear process, but I would say that the process of individuation would tend to be the next step in waking up. But anyway, to look at the stage of individuation, I'd like to talk about the evolutionary stages of consciousness. According to the author of Pluto, The Evolutionary Journey of the Soul, Jeffrey Green, the evolutionary states of one's consciousness can be broken down into these categories. First, you have a dimly evolved state, which is characterized by a focus on base survival instincts. Anywhere from maybe 2 to 5% of the population tends to be in this dimly evolved state at any given time. Rising up somewhat from the dimly evolved state is the herd state or the consensus state. And then, of course, this is usually the majority of people, about 70 to 80% of the population. And the herd state is characterized by groupthink and reliance on external, quote, authority. So the herd or the consensus state is basically collectivism. And then rising up from that, now you have the individuated state, which is about questioning one's social or societal conditioning, making a shift toward personal autonomy, and seeking one's own unique path. Usually only about maybe 15 to 20% of all people fall into this category of the individuated state. Now, of course, these percentages can change at any time, depending on whether we as individuals will this to happen and we get out there and try to influence others. We can improve this situation. And then beyond the individuated state is the spiritual state, which is alignment to universal truths or natural law, transcendence beyond the lies of the ego, and service to others, or service to truth. A shift toward individuation through increased solitude, personal introspection, and authenticity is a gateway to awakening. Just generally living a more authentic life, doing what it is that you are tasked to do on this earth during your short lifetime. So rising up from the individuated state is that spiritual state, and that is a part of waking up. So let's talk about spirituality. And I'd like to look at the etymology of the words spirituality and psychology. The word spirituality is derived from the Latin noun spiritus, meaning breath, breath of a god, inspiration, and soul. So whether it is recognized or not, every being is a spiritual being, simply by the fact that every being is animated with the breath of life. Or in other words, has conscious experience. Consciousness is spirituality. But let's look at this even further and look at the word psychology. The word psychology is derived from the Greek noun psyche, meaning breath, spirit, and soul. Sound familiar? And from, of course, the Latin noun logia, meaning study of. Therefore, what psychology means is the study of the soul. All right, so spirituality in large part is about psychology. It's about understanding the self, learning about one's own psyche. And in the words of Michael Tessarion, whose work I greatly value, one must never leave consciousness at the door. Even more on waking up and more on achieving that spiritual state is understanding natural law. Natural law is a set of universal, non-man-made, binding, and immutable conditions that cannot be changed, that govern both the seen physical domain and the unseen spiritual domain. These laws govern the consequences of behavior for beings who can understand the difference between harmful and non-harmful behavior. And natural law can be observed and scientifically tested. For instance, if one wants to discover the natural law of freedom, which says that freedom is directly proportional to morality, then that person need only look to examples of populations that behaved immorally in the aggregate and thus experienced a decline in freedom as a result. And the final part of waking up is service to truth. A significant part of waking up and reaching the spiritual state in one's evolutionary path is to devote oneself to the pursuit of and service to truth. This is because truth shatters the illusions that keep us stuck in physical and psychological enslavement. Service to truth entails having a strong desire to seek truth relentlessly by challenging one's conditioning, delusions, and biases. This path requires that one learns how to think properly through what is called the trivium method, which in brief is grammar, logic, and rhetoric in that order. But this third phase, the rhetoric phase of the trivium method, and the end goal of service to truth, is the application, sharing, and teaching of knowledge to empower others so that freedom may emerge and thrive. And I like to think of going down the path of service to truth as being symbolized by the archetype of Mercury. If we aim to be like this archetype of Thoth, Hermes, Mercury, this messenger of truth, then what's going to happen is not only are we ourselves as individuals not likely to be fooled and easily enslaved or coerced, but when we share truth with others and help them to wake up, then other people are not very likely to drag you down with them into deeper enslavement. Okay, we discovered what awakening really is, so let's do the same with the word freedom. First, I would say that freedom is having external anarchy, meaning that there is an absence of man-made external rulership. So there would be no government. Nobody would perceive that any other human or institution or organization has actual authority or has any right to rule over or control its subjects. So that is what external anarchy means. It means without rulers. That's it. Anarchy does not mean chaos or mayhem, like so many people have been brainwashed into believing that anarchy is. Okay, so you want external anarchy to have freedom. And then the other part of freedom is internal monarchy. This is having freedom by personal responsibility and self-governance. You understand that you can only control your own thoughts, emotions, and actions, and that's it. And that's quite a lot of power if you only knew. And then to go a little bit further into how external anarchy with internal monarchy would play out is I want to touch on the idea of having no slaves below, because it's very easy for so-called anarchists, many freedom advocates, to go about claiming that they want freedom, that there should be no masters above. And most people, unless you're a total masochist, understand that there should be no masters above, right? But how many people really understand that there should also be no slaves below? So what freedom also means is having complete disengagement with slavery dynamics. And let's see how we actually get to this place of true freedom. It is the law of freedom, which just says that freedom and morality are directly proportional. Very simple. As morality increases, freedom increases. And as morality declines, freedom declines. And this is not some mystical concept. This is very much rooted in reality. And as I said earlier, can be observed, can be tested. There are no shortage of examples throughout our human past that illustrate this law in action. So there you have it, the dynamic that creates freedom. If you want freedom, then you need to behave in a more moral way. And on to the next section, strategies to tip the scales. And what I mean by tip the scales is to tip them back into a level state of order, balance, symmetry, harmony, and justice. So the first strategy for achieving freedom, I'm going to say, is alignment to natural law. That is really number one, because if you aren't going to actually act as a moral being as per the law of freedom, you cannot have freedom. Contrary to what some may believe about natural law exists for the benefit of all life because it ensures order, balance, and justice. Per the law of freedom, once we align our behavior with natural law in the aggregate as a species, we are well on our way toward aggregate freedom. Alignment to natural law morality entails that one lives by the golden rule, which could be stated in the apophatic, negative way as, do not treat others the way you would not like to be treated. And this means that if one wants freedom to manifest, one should not engage in any of the following transgressions against natural law: murder, assault, rape, trespass, coercion, deception, or theft of property. Every one of these actions constitutes a theft, so don't steal. Moving on to achieving freedom by individual action. And this is really the heart of my presentation today, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this. Let's look at the definition, a dictionary definition of the word individualism. This is a philosophy that favors freedom of action for individuals over collective or state control. And it is the habit of being independent and self-reliant. So we need to start there. And then once we wake up to the understanding that we only have control over our own thoughts or worldview, emotions, and actions, we can implement the wisdom that the only way to create freedom is to create it ourselves with our own individual action. If you remain asleep to the slavery in our world and do not take action against it by acting morally and sharing your knowledge, then you are ensuring the condition remains the same. If we do nothing to make necessary changes in our own lives, to act as moral beings, and to teach others about natural law morality, we can never expect others to do the same. And even if others do not do their part in becoming teachers of morality, you still push forward in the work toward freedom because it is the right thing to do. And you push forward with the faith that others will follow suit by your positive example. Here's what Carl Jung had to say on the matter. He said, "It is unfortunately only too clear that if the individual is not truly regenerated in spirit, society cannot be either, for society is the sum total of individuals in need of redemption. I can therefore see it only as a delusion when the churches, or the governments or other controlling institutions, try, as they apparently do, to rope the individual into some social organization and reduce him to a condition of diminished responsibility, instead of raising him out of the torpid, mindless mass and making clear to him that he is the one important factor, and that the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul." To continue on with how we can achieve freedom through individual action. With the understanding that each individual must take personal responsibility for acting morally and sharing truth with others toward the emergence of freedom, you realize that you cannot rely on others to do the necessary work. You might even realize that your great work or magnum opus could complement or support the proliferation of freedom. Your contribution to this goal of achieving freedom, if that's what you choose to work toward, should involve exposing important truths by your chosen method. For example, you might get into podcasting, publishing a book, a blog, a website, or getting involved with art creation that teaches in some way, etc. If not you, then who else will take charge? You are the only person who you can truly count on to awaken, individuate, and to advocate for freedom. You have the power to lead others by example and to be a catalyst in a movement toward mass awakening and freedom. That brings us to the tipping point, 3 rules for epidemic. So these will be 3 strategies from the book, The Tipping Point, as strategies applied to the goal of achieving freedom, of getting a freedom movement to actually take off. The first of the 3 rules for epidemic, as applied to the goal of achieving freedom, is the law of the few. In the book, The Tipping Point, the author Malcolm Gladwell provides evidence that when a large trend or movement takes off, it is usually a very small group of people who tend to catalyze a movement. And one of the first examples that he gives is that there was a shoe called the Hush Puppy that largely went out of fashion and was being pulled from the shelves. But a very small group of young folks in New York started wearing these shoes, and this trend spread quickly and in a really massive way. The fashion designers started picking up on the trend and rolling out more of these shoes and putting them back on the shelves. But it all came down to this really small group of people wearing the shoe. So it is usually a very small group of people who tend to catalyze a movement. And that's so important to recognize that a movement doesn't start suddenly with a bunch of people already doing something. It starts with some little tiny catalyst. And among this small group are 3 key character types: connectors, mavens, and salespeople. Connectors are individuals who have links to many different social groups and a wide variety of people. These connectors tend to be highly extroverted, social butterflies, very talkative, and they can really set you up with different networks of people who can help to spread your ideas. And then the mavens, these tend to be more introverted people that you have to seek out. The mavens are information specialists who people trust for their vast knowledge and sound advice on a highly specialized subject. Getting a maven on board with your idea or a movement that you want to start can be quite powerful because people trust the mavens. And then there are the salespeople, pretty self-explanatory. These are highly persuasive individuals who have a strong ability to sell ideas. And we're going to look at examples of how powerful these 3 character types can be. But I just want to say that you do not have to necessarily be a connector, a maven, or a salesperson yourself. You only have to know one or more of these individuals in order to utilize their power. So it really is all about who you know, isn't it? Let's look at how connectors spread info like wildfire. Malcolm Gladwell points out in The Tipping Point that both Paul Revere and William Dawes warned the colonial militias of the approaching British troops on April 18, 1775. Although both men traveled a similar distance that night, only one of these men succeeded, and this man was Paul Revere, who we all remember. This is because Paul Revere was a connector. Paul Revere already had high social status and an extensive network of communities who trusted him, while William Dawes did not. This example shows how important connectors are in the spread of information that creates an epidemic, so to speak. And I think our reality would look a hell of a lot different if not for this connector, Paul Revere. So that's how powerful a connector can be, if you can get a connector or two or more in your back pocket. And on to the mavens. We need to learn about how important the mavens are in starting an epidemic, because people heed advice from the mavens. In the afterword of The Tipping Point, the author discusses a case study of how the Lexus brand leveraged the influence of mavens to maintain the trustworthiness of Lexus after a recall in 1989 due to a mechanical defect of the cars. This recall could have been detrimental for the new Lexus brand because they created a reputation based on trustworthiness. The Toyota Corporation knew that most of their initial Lexus customer base consisted of car mavens, because only a car maven would purchase a new luxury vehicle from what was then a largely unknown brand. The strategy that worked to restore Lexus's reputation was to provide exceptional customer service individually to each maven, rather than sending out a mass announcement about the recall, which could really annoy people. In one case, the Lexus company even flew a mechanic out to a very remote part of Alaska to fix one of these vehicles. The assumption in this case study is that these car mavens went on to tell others about the exceptional customer service they received, thus restoring the Lexus brand. People must have listened to these car mavens who bought the first Lexus cars and then took their advice and purchased the vehicles themselves. Okay, so that's how important it can be to have some mavens on your side who appreciate the ideas that you're trying to spread, because they will go on to teach other people about that idea of how to create freedom or whatever your idea is, and then people will listen to them. Moving on to the salespeople, because salespeople infect others with enthusiasm. And this story always really struck me and stuck with me in my memory because of how crucial this particular salesman was to helping the Impressionist movement to survive well beyond its initial ridicule. So one of the most powerful contributing factors to the success that Claude Monet enjoyed during his lifetime as a painter, while many of his colleagues died largely unknown and in poverty, was due to Monet's friend and salesman, Paul Durand-Ruel. Durand-Ruel had the gift of charisma and persuasion and was able to convince wealthy patrons that this new art style called Impressionism was a style for the wealthy to embrace. He framed the appeal by convincing patrons that Impressionist paintings would wonderfully showcase their carefree, luxurious lifestyles, and that the traditional academic art was too somber, religious, and passé. Additionally, Durand Rule promoted the works of Monet and some of Monet's contemporaries at great personal financial risk and through building many relationships as a salesman. As a result of his efforts and a few other factors, Monet and several other colleagues were able to enjoy notoriety and financial success during their lifetimes. And this was despite the fact that Impressionism was initially a niche and heavily ridiculed movement. I mean, these guys were the laughing stock. And there were some other contributing factors to the success of Monet and some of his contemporaries, such as just having a lot of courage and starting their own independent art shows and persistence, new technological advancements in paint and woodblock prints, etc. But I consider this factor, this salesman Paul Durand Rule, to have been crucial in the fact that the Impressionist movement made it beyond this ridicule and criticism. And this salesman was so imperative to the thriving of the Impressionist movement, as well as the opening of the door for other modern and contemporary art of today. And just to finish up on the law of the few, here is a quote by C.S. Lewis from Mere Christianity. He said that good and evil increase at compound interest. That's why the little decisions we make every day are of infinite importance. And that's why your actions as an individual in a movement are so infinitely important. The next rule for creating epidemics, the next strategy to apply to the goal of achieving freedom, is the stickiness factor. The stickiness factor, as coined by Malcolm Gladwell in The Tipping Point, is the factor in a movement that is memorable, catchy, or sticky. The stickiness factor compels others to join in and share it with others, turning the movement into a viral campaign. Stickiness can be created by sending engaging messages that invoke emotional investment. Pure logic alone does not usually stick in the mind. People tend to receive information through their right brain, emotional or subconscious connection to the data. And in order to make a product or idea sticky, one should produce high-quality work with messages that are emotionally striking and that bedazzle with art, music, a great story, a strong sentiment. This quality content will stick in the audience member's mind and leave them wanting more. This stickiness will cause the audience members to remember your ideas. I want to emphasize how important it is as freedom advocates, as alternative researchers, and promoters of alternative media content. We need to produce professional, high-quality work that contains a lot of art and beauty in some way. And the truth of the matter is that if you aren't presenting professional and eloquently delivered, aesthetically pleasing work, then people will not receive it very well. They may shun it. And that is a problem, that people will allow their emotional reasoning to cause them to reject information. But that is the harsh truth of the matter. You know, the dark occultists of the world, the people in marketing and advertising and propaganda are certainly using their knowledge of the stickiness factor to their advantage. And we as advocates for freedom need to also use the stickiness factor to our advantage in our work. if we want to compete with the dark side. Here are some examples of how stickiness grabs and holds attention. Malcolm Gladwell provides two main examples of the stickiness factor in The Tipping Point, which include innovations in stickiness for the children's TV show Sesame Street, as well as refinements to this formula in the children's TV show Blue's Clues. Sesame Street was among the first in children's TV to pair education and entertainment. The stickiness factor was entertainment, such as humor, music, puppetry, and breaking the fourth wall. Blue's Clues refined the formula with a focused narrative, interactive design, and with repetition by airing each episode for 5 consecutive days. Both TV shows were wildly successful. And other examples of stickiness include the memorable Columbia Record Club's 12 Records for a Penny, or 12 Hot Hits for a Cool Penny promotion, which was one of the most successful marketing campaigns in history. The book Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood by Rebecca Wells was sticky because of its emotional themes and relatable characters. The slogan, "Winston tastes good like a cigarette should," stuck in people's minds because of its slightly odd phrasing, which sparked discussion about it. So there are many, many different methods in which to create stickiness to your idea, your product, your movement. You just need to really, I would say, research marketing and advertising and promotion techniques and study what has worked in the past. And then also play around with and explore different ideas for sparking emotional investment in people and this memorable stickiness factor and see what works. And on to the third strategy for creating epidemics. And again, we are applying this strategy to the goal of achieving freedom. And we're looking at the power of context. In the book, The Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell explains the power of context, that the context of where or how people are exposed to ideas can have a huge influence on how well these ideas are received. And to illustrate that, here is the broken windows theory, a criminological concept by James Q. Wilson and George L. Kelling, which suggests that visible disorder in an environment, such as broken windows, or it could be graffiti or an unpleasant stench or any kind of disorderly environment, encourages disorderly conduct. Conversely, the restoration of cleanliness and order to an environment leads to dramatic changes as people perceive that this is an environment in which to engage in better conduct. And what I get out of learning about the power of context, if we apply it to the ignition of a freedom movement, is that due to the power of context, your added presence as a teacher in a movement signals others to join in. This increased peer influence in a truth or freedom movement can help others find the courage to participate in their own way and to cause enough traction for the movement to reach a critical mass or tipping point. So you really have no idea how powerful you as an individual can be as somebody leading by example. You may have peers in your personal life, in your peer circle, who will see you speaking out, doing the right thing, teaching natural law or morality, and they might say to themselves, oh, well, if he or she can do it, then maybe so could I. And the more and more advocates for freedom, teachers of natural law that join in as individuals, the more you create this powerful context, this environment, this peer influence that helps to show others that maybe that's not such a big deal to do. Maybe that's looking pretty normal. Here are some examples of the power of context in action. And most of these examples are pretty dark, but we can still use this knowledge for the right reasons, for good. The first example is the Milgram experiment, which everybody should become familiar with if they are not already. In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram of Yale University conducted an experiment in which participants believed that they were involved in a learning experiment. They were instructed by an authority figure in a white lab coat to administer electric shocks to an actor who they believed to be a learner actually receiving the shocks, when in fact the person was just a paid actor not receiving any actual shocks. The results were shocking and showed that 65% of participants would obey an immoral command that could result in the death of another being under a context which frames the authoritative figure as legitimate. And Philip Zimbardo, who we're going to talk about in the next example, has spoken about how there were different variations of the Milgram experiment done. And this other variation of the Milgram experiment showed that anywhere from 50 to 100% of participants, depending upon gender, would willingly administer electric shocks to a live puppy, given the context of perceived authority, such as a professor as the authority figure. Pretty sickening and terrifying, and shows you that people will willingly obey any immoral command as long as somebody who they perceive as an authority figure commands them to do so. And there was even another version of the Milgram experiment that showed that when participants said no, then the following participants who witnessed somebody else saying no, they were far more likely to also decline to administer the electric shocks. All right, so that shows you the power of context and peer influence in the decisions that people make. Moving on to the Stanford prison experiment. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo, a psychologist then at Stanford University, conducted an experiment which placed 24 male college students in roles as prisoners and guards in a simulated prison. The study was terminated after only 6 days as the context of the prison and power dynamics led to cruel and abusive behavior. So very similar to the Milgram experiment in what the results indicate about human behavior and our ability and our likelihood to be swayed by a particular context and environment and the behavior of others. And there's a great movie called Stanford Prison Experiment from 2015 that I recommend to people to watch to understand this experiment. Let's look now at the dancing mania or dancing plague, which was a phenomenon that occurred in Europe multiple times between the 14th and 17th centuries, in which groups of people, sometimes in the thousands, danced erratically for seemingly no reason to the point of exhaustion and collapse. And then somewhat similar to that example, in that there is dancing involved, is a video called First Follower Leadership from Dancing Guy, which shows a lone man dancing in a park. Shortly after a second man joins him in dancing, the entire park joins in to form a large dance party. And this goes to show that when one individual, as powerful as that individual is, takes an action that is different or unique by him or herself, then that individual might be viewed as a weirdo. Like, what are you doing? But as soon as you have a group of 2 or more people, that group context shows people that there may be some legitimacy to this action that the group is taking. And so whether for better or for worse, you can use that knowledge to your advantage as an advocate for freedom, and see if you can apply what was learned from these experiments towards something positive in trying to spread your own ideas. And on to the next section, setting the work into motion. We need to focus on the self first. So here's a quote that is attributed to Jesus in the Christian Bible from Matthew chapter 7, verse 3 through 5. He said, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." With a goal as lofty as spiritually waking up and attempting to free all life from slavery, one must first focus on self-care, which involves healing from any past trauma and present conditions to include ill physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual health. I'm going to talk about the great work, because I think that knowing about what the great work is and getting started on that is an integral part of spiritual development, and possibly could be an avenue toward triggering a mass awakening, as well as bringing about more freedom in the world when we engage in our great work. According to Aleister Crowley, the British occultist and ceremonial magician, the great work is to have knowledge and conversation with the higher self. In addition to the uniting of opposites, the great work is the attainment of knowledge and conversation with the higher self, also known as the holy guardian angel. This means that to complete the great work, one must enter into dialogue with the inner voice of the intuition. One must listen. The intuition knows right from wrong and knows what one's true will is to do on this earth. The great work is a highly personal and unique process. No one can tell you what your great work or legacy should be. I can only provide the guidance that if you say you want freedom, that living in accordance with and teaching natural law is the answer. If you are truly listening to your intuition, that voice may lead you to the completion of a body of work that contributes to the end of slavery. The next section is harness education, skills, and talents. And I'd like to address the importance of autodidactic education. To gain needed information about the human condition or any other subject, one must diligently sift through a wide, eclectic array of information. For those who desire to tackle the problem of slavery, it is highly advisable to journey down the darkest possible rabbit holes of knowledge in order to fully understand the problems that plague the human and animal condition. And since, quote, alternative knowledge will not be taught by the standard channels of education, we must become autodidactic or self-taught. This means that instead of being told what to think, we learn how to think properly through the trivium method. Once we know how to think properly, we can apply this methodology to the attainment of any education we may need in order to do the work of ending slavery. This education might include learning about the dynamics and details of the problem so that it can be taught to others. We can also become autodidacts of technological skills, visual art, music, writing, and many other needed skills. Let's expand upon why and how you should harness your skills and talents. In order to morally educate the public, you will need to harness your natural aptitudes and to develop skills. Developing talents will greatly aid in how well your work is received by others. This step can be difficult for those who do not feel they are good at anything. I recommend that you start with what you enjoy or look to those who you admire, who are already successful in sharing their talents. You can mimic your role models as a starting point. And really, any interest, skill, or talent can be used in becoming a teacher of morality and natural law, or in aiding in waking others up. For example, you might get into podcasting, broadcasting, writing, visual art, dance, theater, comedy, and so many other methods. The possibilities are endless, really. But technological skills are required to influence a mass awakening and freedom. The teacher of natural law can choose from countless art forms and mediums through which to teach morality. And in conjunction with that chosen medium, it is computer technology, web publishing, and broadcasting that is the most effective means of disseminating a message in the fastest and most widespread way. Ultimately, you just need to activate your true will and do the great work. I understand that displaying our work to others who may criticize us can be quite frightening. However, the only way to resolve the problem of slavery that we are currently facing is simply for you, the individual, to muster up the will to push forward with courage, no matter how fearful you are. And I understand how frightening it can be to speak up and to engage in any kind of public speaking or putting your work out there. I myself have always had intense fears of public speaking, and yet I found myself constantly in situations in which I had to engage in public speaking and briefing. But you know what? I realized eventually that once you undergo the process of individuation and you live a more authentic life and you have true care and you're speaking about matters that you truly care about, that tends to dispel a lot of the fears and the apprehension. And that's why activating true care and your true will is so imperative to being able to get started on doing your great work. So take the first, perhaps small step with consistent effort and dedication, and chisel away at these goals at your own pace. But do get started on your great work and on the one great work of ending slavery. Your role as an individual and your work as a teacher of morality is the catalyst needed to uplift all life past the tipping point toward awakening and freedom.